I'm actually shocked and excited to hear that Rabbi Breger is a Sephardic Jewish immigrant to the United States. Sephardic Jewish history has long been kind of decentered in U.S. Jewish history, and we're also going to be talking tonight about a decentered Jewish history in the U.S., so this is working out. So I'd like to first extend a few gratitudes, first to the University of Arizona Libraries, Special Collections, really where my relationship with Tucson in an academic sense began, the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies, the past and present staff at the Jewish History Museum and Holocaust Center, including Robert Schneiderman, Ariel Goldberg, Brian Davis, Josie Shapiro, Gugu Moya, Annie Swindisky, Nika Kaiser, and Lisa Schachter-Brooks. I would also like to thank my host families, Patty Bear and Don Alpert in the month of January, and Deborah Osarian and Bobby Present in February and March, who have generously opened up their homes to me for the past 2 months. I'd like to thank my parents, Jane and Mitchell Greenberg, who did travel out of state to be here. I'd like to thank you for bringing me into a world which I feel endlessly curious about, and I'm privileged enough to get paid to study it. And finally, I'd like to thank Lori Melrude and Lenny Molina for their gracious assistance helping me think through the complexities of honoring Jewish histories in a space and during a time when the histories of so many others are being demolished with impunity. For those who do not already know, we are standing in a space called Special Collections, which is a fancy term for a university's archival holdings, which again is a fancy way to say this space is dedicated to the preservation of histories that have been deemed worthy of preservation with a little help from your tax dollars. Part of these deserving histories are some of the Jewish histories of the U.S. Southwest, a sliver of which I will discuss tonight. But outside these walls, protecting these special collections, just 113 miles southwest of Tucson, another community's histories are being destroyed, again with a little help from your tax dollars. Beginning in early February of this year, the U.S. government began blowing up a mountain on protected lands in the Sonoran Desert Wilderness, specifically on the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, a space which holds spiritual and memorial significance to multiple groups native to this region, including the Tohono O'odham peoples. Without meaningful consultation with tribal stakeholders, the Department of Homeland Security is destroying an ecosystem ostensibly protected under the government's strictest public land designations to continue the expansion of a border wall between the U.S. and Mexico in the name of an imminent threat to national security. This irreparable violence towards an environment that has supported human life for over 16,000 years builds on a multi-century tradition of government land theft and occupation in this region. Tonight's lecture will situate the Jewish subject within this landscape long marked by genocide, stolen land, and the forced removal of native peoples, first by the Spanish, then by Mexico, and finally by the United States. As a historian, as a Jew of the diaspora, as a white person, and finally as a citizen to a nation that does not challenge nor question my legal belonging to be here, I hope that my approach to scholarship and pedagogy grapples with the complicated relational histories against which borderland Jewish histories have always existed. In 1927, a 26-year-old Jack Swed, a merchant of Syrian and Jewish origin, arrived at the U.S. port of entry between Tijuana and San Diego. After peddling imported clothing and other fine goods across northern Mexico through the final years of the Mexican Revolution and into the 1920s, Swed had his eyes set on Baja California for his next business venture. Newspapers have told him that Tijuana's economy was expanding rapidly in response to Americans' continued appetite for alcohol and gambling despite new federal restrictions. Real estate prices were growing along with the border town's economy, and Swed secured a storefront on Avenida Revolution, the town's primary tourist district, well below market rate after a chance encounter with a property owner and fellow Jewish entrepreneur working in the alcohol distribution sector. Catering to Hollywood elites, American socialites, along with prominent Mexican politicians, Swed's imports would go on to become a reliable stopover for perfumes and jewelry in Tijuana's bustling downtown for over 50 years. This lecture examines the experiences and contributions of immigrant entrepreneurs, specifically foreign-born retail merchants, in the US-Mexico border region between 1911 and 1933. During these decades, the commercial landscape on the border was shaped by three distinct but interconnected processes: US corporate imperialism in Mexico, the militarization of the US-Mexico border, and the age of quotas and prohibition in America. These processes were bound up with new binational approaches to nation building and profoundly reshaped the ethno-racial and economic landscape of the US-Mexico border region at the turn of the 20th century. Drawing from two different case studies of Jewish immigrant entrepreneurs from both sides of the border, Hyman Capon, a military tailor from Lithuania, and Jack Swed, a Syrian merchant of fine clothes and perfumes, I will explore how the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution in 1910 and new restrictions on alcohol and immigration to the US in the following decade created new pathways for commercial and national acculturation for immigrant entrepreneurs. I argue that the histories of Jewish immigrant entrepreneurs in the border region offer a window into how one's commercial endeavors existed between the shifting needs and expectations of Mexican and American nationalisms and their ties to Jewish ethnic immigrant networks. Through direct and indirect participation in the militarization along the border and the alcohol trade during Prohibition, commercial activities amongst Jewish merchants in the US-Mexico border region in the early 20th century offer a micro-history of how Jewish businessmen leveraged entrepreneurship to erase or renegotiate their own Jewish otherness in a landscape that increasingly surveilled and criminalized newly constructed categories of ethno-racial otherness. So the Mexican Revolution is often written out of most dominant accounts of US history, despite its role as the earliest and arguably one of the most important popular social uprisings in North America in the 20th century. The belief that the Mexican Revolution was neatly contained south of the US border and thus not relevant to US history is a fantasy of American essentialism when considering that the outbreak, the duration, and the outcomes of the Mexican Revolution are inextricably linked to the immigration, economic, political, and military histories of the US in the 20th century. I will provide a brief overview of some of the socioeconomic dynamics that influenced the start of the Mexican Revolution and how the subsequent militarization along the border gives the context for new commercial opportunities that benefited immigrant entrepreneurs on both sides of the border. So the duration of the Mexican Revolution actually remains nebulous and debated, but most historical accounts mark the start and end dates as the decade between 1910 and 1920. The geographically fragmented Civil War was unified by a fight for economic equity, land and labor rights, and increasingly, a rejection of foreign corporate imperialism profiting off of Mexico's foundational industries. Another widely agreed upon point is that the revolution was motivated in large part by the proto-neoliberal economic policies under a 34-year dictatorship by Porfirio Diaz. Motivated by a desire to bring Mexico into a modern global capitalist market, alongside a drive to displace and replace the country's indigenous communities with white foreigners, Porfirian development projects facilitated European and US immigration while creating legal incentives for foreign investment in Mexican industries. Specifically in the realms of agribusiness, mining, and transportation, government legislation routinely favored foreign capital and management over bids by Mexican nationals to control or profit over their country's industrial and urban development. A few of the many examples include the Cananea copper mine, just 93 miles south of here in Tucson. At the turn of the century, the mine was owned and managed by US-born William Green, who by 1905 was considered one of the wealthiest businessmen in the world. Around the same time, Los Angeles oil tycoon Edward Doheny was busy in Tampico, a port city in northeastern state of Tamaulipas, where he controlled 85% of all Mexican oil production. And the list goes on. Anglo-American investors and employers often structured their mining operations in Mexico in ways that paralleled racial labor hierarchies in the US, with the best paid and lowest risk positions reserved for white foreigners, while a largely non-white labor force were marginalized to the high-risk, low-wage positions. When the Mexican Revolution began in 1910, the US controlled over 200 million acres of Mexican land, mostly in northern Mexico, with over 1 billion invested in Mexican agriculture, railroads, telegraph systems, timber plantations, mines, and petroleum fields. The financial and imperial veracity of American investors in Mexican industries was a significant factor in the spread of economic discontent amongst Mexican laborers and revolutionaries who sought to challenge the larger system of imperial capitalism between the US and Mexico through the subsequent decade. So the silences around the Mexican Revolution as an important part of US history means overlooking these early dynamics of US corporate imperialism in Mexico, as well as a foundational decade of militarization along the US-Mexico border. As I'm sure you've heard, mainstream media and academic discussions often point to the establishment of US Border Patrol in 1924 as the origin point to our contemporary practices of human policing and criminalization along the southern border. However, the decade prior suggests that the Mexican Revolution was a foundational period during which the US began to militarize the border to resist foreign invasion and protect international private investments. While US corporate imperialism was pervasive across Mexico and more broadly across Latin America, the Mexican Revolution marked US investments in northern Mexican states as particularly vulnerable. For example, the majority of fighting in northern Mexico occurred in the state of Chihuahua, which is south of Texas, where US companies owned nearly 1/4 of the land. By 1911, the government had sent 20,000 troops to the border with the aim of upholding neutrality laws, national sovereignty, and most importantly, in defense of American private interests in Mexico. The economic and political destabilization during Mexico's revolutionary decade, alongside the US military's responses, also created new economic opportunities for immigrant entrepreneurs. The border region during wartime proved particularly lucrative for immigrants and recent foreign arrivals who had ties to transatlantic and transnational ethnic networks, which would help them access and move capital. The militarization along the US-Mexico border during the Revolution marked the category of immigrant entrepreneur with new levels of political and national significance. Beyond territorial defense and protecting US assets and investments, troops stationed at the border were instructed to surveil activities of US citizens, particularly gun runners. The sales of armed equipment by a US citizen to Mexican revolutionary factions would have been considered deeply unpatriotic and encouraging of a spreadable popular rebellion with the potential to upset a wide net of US corporate investments. Alternatively, the militarization along the border opened up new avenues for linking US patriotism and national obligations with commerce. Increasingly, scholars of modern Mexican history have explored the role of immigrant entrepreneurs during the Mexican Revolution. Research specifically on the Chinese and Middle Eastern diasporas in Mexico suggests that multilingual merchants with connections to transnational commercial orbits were uniquely situated to fill gaps in the economy during wartime. However, the participation of Jewish immigrant entrepreneurs in new revolutionary era economies on either side of the border has largely been overlooked in the literature. It is within this context of borderland merchants during the Mexican Revolution that I situate the history of the first generation of the Capon family in southern Arizona and their choice to link up their commercial endeavors with the needs of the US military. This decision to align immigrant entrepreneurship with US national interests provided a commercial foundation upon which the family built and expanded to become one of the most significant mercantile corporations in the border region through the mid-20th century. Born in Lithuania in 1874, Hyman Capon was part of the mass migration from Eastern Europe to the US between 1880 and 1920. Seeking opportunity beyond the deteriorating political and economic conditions within which Jews found themselves in Europe, the Capon family settled in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in 1892 when Hyman was 18 years old. It was here he began working as a tailor, met and married his wife, Dora Loon, and started a family. Escaping high levels of industrial pollution in the east, the Capons moved to the drier climate of the southwest and settled in Tucson in 1906, where they opened a dry cleaning business. Hyman Capon began working as a military tailor in El Paso, Texas in 1910, a move undoubtedly motivated by the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution and the unprecedented occupation of US military troops along the border. Francisco Pancho Villa's raid of Columbus, New Mexico in March of 1916, the first instance of foreign intervention into US territory since the War of 1812, should be noted. And then following the persecution of Villa by US General John Pershing, this spurred the arrival of an additional 10 to 20,000 troops to the region. A supply base was established at Camp Furlong to support the increased levels of military personnel, and by the end of the year, Columbus, New Mexico boasted the largest population in New Mexico. And soon after, Hyman Capon opened up a new branch of his tailoring business there. So even with the pull of World War I, the US maintained troops across the border region through the end of the Mexican Revolution in 1920, and the Capon family's final move to Nogales, Arizona in 1919 was likely a response to the sustained military occupation. Hyman opened a new tailoring business and negotiated an exclusive contract with the US Army as the tailor for Camp Stephen D. Little. According to conversations that I've had with living members of the Capon family, Hyman's contract with the US Army designated him as the tailor to the Black American cavalry stationed in Nogales. You see an image of them to the right, on the right of the screen. Segregated Army troops composed of Black Americans, or Buffalo Soldiers as they were labeled, were made up of free slaves young workers, farmers, and simply those looking for work. In the shadow of the Civil War and the Jim Crow South, Buffalo soldiers were often sent to the most desolate posts, issued faulty equipment, or worn out horses, and were served spoiled or rationed food supplies. German and Irish American troops were increasingly known for their high desertion rates, and a culture of anti-Semitism reigned in the military, making Jewish conscription also undesirable. In the critical study of African American participation in the Mexican Revolution, the historian Gerald Ford found that African American soldiers were seen favorably in contrast to recent immigrants who held a reputation for their insubordination to their white superiors. The trope of the Buffalo soldiers' passivity, subordination, and reliability, coupled with pervasive, institutionalized black racism, resulted in black Americans being the group most likely sent into battle during this time. So this is a complicated landscape that we situate Capon in, one in which the US government employed a white Ashkenazi immigrant to outfit black American soldiers, directly and indirectly charged with defending and preserving the US newly conquered lands as white and Protestant, while upholding and protecting American capitalist imperialism in Mexico. This is hardly an exceptional story in the history of the US that two non-Anglo groups become arbiters of a racial hierarchical system under which they are not privileged nor socially desirable subjects. As historian George Lipschitz has argued, the power of whiteness is dependent upon the manipulation of racial outsiders to fight against one another, to compete for white approval and seek the rewards and privileges of whiteness for themselves, often, not always, at the expense of other racialized populations. So within this framework, we can hold the complexities and the nuances of why an Ashkenazi immigrant and a black American might find their economic well-being bound up with the interests of a political institution rooted in anti-black racism and entrenched in anti-Semitic discourse. Furthermore, we might ask the harder, more interesting, and likely more evasive question here. To what extent might an Ashkenazi Jewish immigrant and a black American at the border at the turn of the 20th century have believed themselves to be linked by otherness within an Anglo-Protestant dominant society? Research on the process of racialization in the progressive era of this country indicates that while both black and immigrant subjects were coded as biologically and culturally outside of dominant racial scripts of Americanness, the historic links between white Americans and Europe complicated any finite social or legal othering of European immigrants. In this regard, my question might be better refined as this: does the black American soldier serve as the constructed other onto which Capon might have projected his own fears and anxieties of unbelonging, and against which he might have constructed a new self-understanding as a white American? We may ask the same question and supplant the black soldier with a Mexican revolutionary, an American Indian, or a Chinese merchant. In other words, to what extent does Capon's position as an immigrant entrepreneur in this complicated geographic and racial milieu at this moment offer him multiple others against which he may construct his own self-understanding as more American and less foreign and possibly less Jewish? So a year after the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution, Jack Swed accompanied his mother on the long journey from Aleppo, Syria to New York City, where the pair met up with Swed's older brothers who had been working already for several years as importers. Much like the Capons, the family's transatlantic journey was part of a larger mobilization of migrants who emigrated from the Middle East and the Mediterranean in search of opportunities beyond the economic and political instability that had defined the Ottoman land since the late 19th century. In his late teens, Swed was sent to Paris to study medicine, but the family's long tradition in entrepreneurship proved too alluring to him, and witnessing his own cousins in Paris, who were also part of an import-export business connected to his brothers back in New York, Swed dropped out of medical school and in 1917 immigrated to northern Mexico to the city of Torreon in Coahuila, where he began working as a traveling merchant. While the historical record has yet to reveal, at least to me, if Swed had existing network connections in Mexico, Syrian or Jewish or both, a credible assumption is that Swed had gotten word that the country's ongoing revolution created new demands for food and arms and other goods that often needed to be imported during wartime. For the better part of a decade, Swed operated within a transnational commercial orbit, linking Mexico to US, to France, and stocking up on imported clothing and dry goods in Mexico City, and then returning by train to northern states to peddle to different revolutionary factions through the end of the war. For a time, Swed also owned a French silks and lingerie store in the port city of Tampico, where employees had money to spend, rich off the continued success of Edward Dohany's Mexican Petroleum Company. But years of American exploitation of resources and labor created challenges eventually for local merchants, and by the late 1920s, Swed had turned his attention to Tijuana, a historically sleepy border town across from San Diego, California, in Mexico's northwesternmost state of Baja California. Restrictions on the sale and consumption of alcohol in the U.S. through the Volstead Act in 1920 had expanded the urban and economic landscapes of many Mexican border towns from the Pacific all the way to El Paso-Ciudad, Juárez, transforming these spaces so as to cater to America's sustained appetite for alcohol and gambling. Swed's journey from Mexico City to Tijuana was a circuitous one, traveling by rail through the transborder desert region connecting the states of Sonora and Arizona, and then back to Mexico by way of California. And this was fully because the Baja Peninsula would remain disconnected by rail from mainland Mexico until 1948. And Swed is traveling in 1927. According to Swed's own testimony, he crossed into the US from Mexico and then back into Mexico from the US without any issues, without a visa, or required government documentation. Specifically, Swed recalls that he was allowed to cross back into Mexico from California because one of the immigration authorities at the port of entry between Tijuana and San Diego was an old friend back from his time working in Tampico. Swed's fluid border mobility is remarkable not only in contrast to our contemporary moment, but also within the context of US-Mexico border surveillance in the 1920s. Building off the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the nativist nationalism sparked during World War I, the shifting needs of industrial labor in the US, along with increasing institutional support of race science, this country passed a series of restrictive immigration policies between 1921 and 1924. The Emergency Quota Act in 1921, followed by the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, aimed to restrict all immigration to the US, with the exception of Northern and Western European immigrants. This is sounding familiar. As the historian Kelly Lytle Hernandez has expertly researched, the passage of new national immigration quotas and establishment of the US Border Patrol as an agency to enforce these quotas, alongside the establishment of the Mexican Department of Migration in 1926, suggests the 1920s were a crucial turning point in solidifying migration control and border enforcement as a bi-national project between the US and Mexico. So by all accounts, Swed's Jewishness and his ties to Syria should have marked his undocumented foreign body as undesirable and excludable under the present immigration laws. However, and as I later confirmed through Swed's National Foreign Registration card that you see behind me, France's mandate over Syria during this moment marked Swed as a French citizen. Existing research on Sephardic migrants to Mexico in the early 20th century has affirmed that Sephardim often leveraged their transnational identities and networks to secure geographic and socioeconomic mobility in the face of growing state restrictions. Swed's journey, particularly the way he leveraged a transnational identity within a border region, transformed by new legal and military restrictions, reflects such trends among Sephardic immigrants in Mexico during this time. The historical record may never reveal which, if any, identifications Swed possessed during these pivotal encounters with U.S. and Mexican immigration inspectors. But in the instance that Swed did have a document confirming Syria as his country of origin, it's not difficult to imagine that crossing from Sonora into Arizona would have been facilitated by his new status as a French citizen. Upon his arrival to Tijuana, the high cost of rent, along with newly passed legislation that made foreign land ownership challenging, Swed had difficulty finding a suitable space for his business. However, a chance introduction with a local alcohol wholesaler by the name of Herbert Jaffe opened up a new window of opportunity. Recognizing the last name, Jaffe, Swed confided in this stranger that his grandfather had been a rabbi back in Aleppo, and that he too was Jewish. Delighted, Jaffe shared that he was also the descendant of a rabbi. And when the conversation turned to business, Swed was offered to lease one of Jaffe's properties along Avenida Revolution for less than 50% of market value. After working for a decade as a traveling merchant between northern Mexico and Mexico City across a variety of clientele, including revolutionary soldiers and the laborers and executives of foreign-owned mining companies, Swed opened the doors to the most significant enterprise of his career, Swed's Imports. A trusted proprietor of French perfume and cashmere, women's clothing, English jackets, and Rolex watches, Swed's Imports was visited by Hollywood celebrities and elite Mexican politicians and presidents. Swed claimed that every Mexican president between the late 1920s and the 1970s visited Swed's Imports. And it's important to keep in mind that the store existed within a rapidly expanding city landscape and soon-to-be duty-free zone, passed in 1933, that was bursting with bars and restaurants, casinos, spas, and a horse race track called the Hipódromo that attracted Mexican nationals and pleasure-seeking Americans who wanted to keep gambling, shopping, and drinking well beyond the repeal of the Volstead Act in 1933. Within the context of European, Asian, and Middle Eastern immigration histories to Mexico in the early 20th century, Swed's story is nuanced and entertaining, but hardly remarkable or exceptional. Like other Middle Eastern immigrants with extensive transnational ethnic networks, Swed capitalized on new market opportunities that cut across American corporate imperialism in Mexico, border militarization during the Revolution, and American nativism in the 1920s. Swed's connection to a broader immigrant trade network, his loose affiliations with any one nation or a national cause, and his linguistic proficiency across, according to him, Spanish, English, Arabic, French, German, Hebrew, and Yiddish marked him as uniquely situated for entrepreneurship in the border region, and an atypical reflection of Middle Eastern immigrants in northern Mexico in the early decades of the 20th century. But what I do find remarkable about Swed's story is how he expands the narrative concerning the Jewish immigrant entrepreneur as it intersected with the anti-alcohol movement in the US. Because of their Mexican context, Swed, and more directly Jaffe, exist outside the narrative that prohibition was necessarily a structural tool of othering and criminalization in a moment that both Jewishness and alcohol were being marked as deeply un-American. The Jewish relationship to alcohol spans centuries, connecting ancient rabbinic law and the dietary regulations of kashrut. And the historian Marnie Davis has argued that in the US prior to the 1920s, Jewish alcohol consumption and production became a way for Jews to integrate commerce and religious ritual while remaining meaningfully Jewish. Across the US, Jewish immigrant entrepreneurs worked as liquor distributors and wholesalers, as well as saloon and liquor store owners. Similar to American Catholics, Jews' relationship to alcohol, as outlined by rabbinic law, highlighted Jewish difference against Anglo-American Protestant culture, while at the same time offering them a commercial niche. However, Jews' economic success and ties to the alcohol trade also helped fuel growing American nativism and anti-Semitism through the 1910s and the 1920s. It had once been a pathway of cultural and economic acculturation to the US. Commercial ties to the alcohol industry were recast under Prohibition as staunchly anti-American. While the Volstead Act did allow for alcohol to be made and sold for medicinal and religious purposes, this did not erase associations between Jews and alternative or illicit economies in the American imaginary. Alongside the immigration restrictions put forth by the quota laws, the anti-alcohol movement was a parallel institution used to mark Jews and other ethnic and religious minorities as outside the bounds of Americanness. The reach of prohibition as a tool of ethno-religious othering, however, is complicated when we return to Tijuana of the 1920s and the experiences of a Jewish alcohol distributor and other Jewish entrepreneurs who existed in an adjacent and related commercial orbit. Jack Swed's proximity and Howard Jaffe's direct connection to an illegal form of entrepreneurship is transformed and effectively protected by the border. Had both entrepreneurs settled just 2 miles north, their commercial livelihood would have been pulled between the increasingly rigid expectations of Americanness and their Jewish identities. Their Mexican context, however, allows for a unique expression of Jewish immigrant entrepreneurship, one that responds to and benefits from a commercial niche during the era of Prohibition without the risk of social or economic marginalization. Drawing from 2 different case studies from both sides of the border, this lecture has explored the experiences and contributions of immigrant entrepreneurs, specifically Jewish foreign-born retail merchants, in the US-Mexico border region between the Mexican Revolution and US Prohibition. Both Hyman Capon, a Jewish military tailor from Lithuania, and Jack Swed, a Jewish merchant and importer from Aleppo, Syria, occupied a cross-border commercial landscape shaped by US corporate imperialism in Mexico, border militarization, and new expressions of Mexican and American nationalisms that recast foreigners as suspect, undesirable, and often criminal. It bears repeating that restrictive laws, particularly those which police the movement of people, goods, and consumption, always open up alternative economies to satisfy needs that do not disappear simply because they have suddenly been labeled illegal. The lives of Capon and Swed reflect the types of immigrant entrepreneurs who may have been particularly poised to fill these new economic niches that grew out of institutional restrictions. These stories show us how Jewish immigrant entrepreneurs to the region navigated a delicate terrain between commercial opportunity and the needs and expectations of their new national contexts. In the case of Hyman Capen, his work as a military tailor aligned him with the interests of the US government, which may have provided some level of protection from an increasingly anti-Semitic and nativist American climate. Alternatively, Jack Swed operated within a commercial context that may have marked him as subversive, but was protected by his national context in Mexico. Ultimately, and most significantly, both Swed and Capen teach us that Mexico, and specifically northern Mexico, is not always a backdoor to US immigration. Some immigrant entrepreneurs were able to leverage the impacts of US imperialism in the region for commercial opportunity and ultimately establish a foundation for future economic and cultural acculturation in their respective national contexts. Thank you.